So what I would like to do is just to kind of connect with the two presentations that preceded mine and focus on litigation, how we can use these arguments in litigation. This is a basic structure of the presentation. The point number one on human rights, I'm not going to address that. I think Mary did a very good job, a very comprehensive analysis of human rights and different treaties and state obligations. And then what I want to move to is just to try to talk a little bit in more informal way in why human rights should be used in the context of tobacco control litigation. Then give one example of how arguments, human rights arguments, can be used to support and defend a specific tobacco control measure, which is a prohibition of tobacco advertisement, promotion, and sponsorship. And finally, conclude with a very successful experience from the region, from the Constitutional Tribunal of Peru, in which all of these things that we've been talking about, shadow reporting, treaties, tobacco control, were incorporated in the court's decision. So the human rights system, as I said, Mary did a very good job talking about this. She talked about the two subjects in human rights law, the state and the individual, so I'm not going to address this. Again, obligations was covered. Language on the right to health was also covered by Mary's presentation. So let's stop now and just talk for a little bit about why human rights and tobacco control. The first reason why I think we need to do a better job at incorporating human rights standards and connecting human rights and tobacco control is that the industry so far has been the user that has used more effectively the human rights language to prevent tobacco control measures or to try to stop the enactment of tobacco control measures. We know that in the United States, it's well known that tobacco advertisement is usually connected with the notion of freedom of expression. That argument we have heard many times in our countries. In Latin America is an argument that has been commonly made to try to attack or try to challenge measures limiting advertisement and promotion and sponsorship of tobacco. So the idea in this, I wanted to connect with something that Matt Myers said in the previous Congress when he was talking about litigation. He said that it was a time for the tobacco control community to retake the courts, to retake the role that rights can have in helping us advance tobacco control. I think this is very similar. We need to retake and regain the human rights discourse for tobacco control. This second point might be applicable to countries around the world, and I'm going to talk about the region that I work on, which is mainly Latin America. Human rights law has definitely a prominent role in political discourse. When a specific issue rises to the point of a human rights issue, it's considered to be in a different level altogether. Working in making that connection, making that sensitization, I never know how to say that word, sensibilizing people and connecting human rights with tobacco control and getting that out definitely will help bring the tobacco control movement and tobacco control arguments to a different level. This connects with what Veronica was saying, how we connect and how we integrate the FCTC and human rights instruments. They're mutually reinforcing. They're not, there's no conflict between human rights and the FCTC, as the industry has argued many times. They're actually work together. Implementing the tobacco control measures as established in the FCTC is a way to advance human rights. So they work together. The last 2 points were also addressed. We know that there's no formal civil society monitoring or formal participation of civil society within the Conference of the Parties for monitoring the implementation of the FCTC. I think what we have been trying to do with Veronica and with other organizations is trying to use the UN system to try to monitor the implementation of the FCTC by using human rights instruments. And kind of this comes back to using the FCTC to actually help human rights bodies understand what the right to health is as it relates to tobacco. So using the FCTC as a way to interpret state obligations as they relate to tobacco control. This is an oversimplification, and I've been trying to really keep not a lot of words in the slides. I know that lawyers tend to put a lot of information in the slides, and then we have to read through a lot of language. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, but keep in mind that this is an oversimplification. We have this toolkit that we have put some on the side of the stage, in which we go into a lot of detail into industry arguments, counter arguments, how we can use human rights to prevent or to respond to industry attacks. And all of these arguments are developed there in more detail. Two types of litigation. Basically, defensive litigation. When we have good tobacco control laws, we need to defend them. We need to work civil society with government trying to defend good tobacco control laws. A good example is the tobacco control law in Colombia was challenged, and there was a great work that was done by Fundación FES, Corporate Accountability International, working with other human rights organizations in Colombia, and we have one of the most comprehensive decisions that any court has issued in the world on upholding and validating a full ban on promotion, advertisement, and sponsorship coming from Colombia, and that was work that was done mainly with the tobacco control community. Offensive litigation, there have only been a handful of cases in which we have used litigation to try to push states to enact tobacco control laws in accordance with the FCTC and with human rights instruments. There's one case, there's one particular example. There were many cases challenged in Mexico trying to attack the weak tobacco control law that was approved by the Mexican Congress, saying that it was not offering the minimum standard of protection in accordance to the FCTC. Some decisions came, one decision particularly came out of that offensive litigation strategy in Mexico. It was a very good decision, but unfortunately the court decided that they could not rule on the merits because of a procedural issue. So the substantive issues were there. The court said that they saw the potential violation, but there was a procedural barrier and they could not rule on the merits. So one of the arguments, I want to give just one example on this. We have heard this, tobacco advertising, promotion and sponsorship measures limiting commercial speech affect freedom of expression. We have heard that many times. The industry does that in all of our countries, legislative debates, then they challenge measures in court. And I want to say that in most jurisdictions around the world, and in particular in Latin America, which is where we work on, there's no affection of the right to freedom of expression. And the main reason is because commercial speech is not protected by the right to freedom of expression. It's just a manifestation of an economic freedom. And I think that's very important because if we push this argument, that makes our lives as lawyers so much easier. It's easy to limit an economic freedom. States have the authority and the obligation to regulate the way commerce is exercised. Limiting a fundamental right, such as the right to freedom of expression, which can be done. I'm not saying that it cannot be done. It's very hard. The standard of proof is really high. You really need to put a very strong case forward for this. I think this connects with what I said at the beginning. Is that we're taking this from the American example that we have, that there have been, sadly, decisions in the United States that have equated commercial speech or had granted commercial speech the same level of protection as freedom of expression. We know that is not the case in other countries around the world. This is what I just said. The right to health permits but requires restriction on commercial freedoms. Of course, the measures are based on scientific evidence. They're proportional. They're legitimate. So any court or an impartial court will see that this is a valid limitation on a commercial freedom. And this is important also to see, and I know we are, this session is happening at the same time that the endgame session is happening, but one of the things that it's, one of the legal, something that is very legally appealing to the FCTC is that it establishes measures that don't affect the essence of the specific rights that the industry could claim that they're being violated. And by this, what I said, using the example of the TAPS measures, is that it doesn't affect the economic activity itself. The industry can still produce, sell, and people can buy tobacco. This is important for many reasons. In a human rights discourse, you really need to protect fundamental rights. The core content of the right to economic freedom is the ability to exercise that right. So the way the FCTC is framed, what it's saying is establishing a minimum set of measures that need to be implemented in order to advance tobacco control, and that is totally in line with human rights law. So I think this is important to focus on that notion of passive market. So it's a market that is tolerated, but the state actively disencourages the individuals to participate in that particular market in order to protect the public health. And I think this is where the FCTC and human rights are totally in line. This, I'm not going to address this in detail because it was talked, but I was going to put another example of another shadow report and concluding recommendations to Brazil in 2009, but we have seen those already. And finally, the case of the Constitutional Tribunal in Peru. This is a challenge. I think it was not the industry directly, it were individuals challenging smoke-free law. They challenged the establishment of smoke-free environments, the prohibition of having places exclusively for smokers, and the prohibition of smoking in open areas in educational institutions. So those are the three main arguments that the plaintiffs were putting forward. We worked with, together with the Campaign for Tobacco for Kids, with a local organization called COLAD. We helped them provide some of the arguments that they use to support the government response. But then what we did in this case is that we also filed an amicus brief together with TFK and the FCA. And some of the arguments that in our amicus brief were taken into account by the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Tribunal. And this, I just want to read the last part, what is really underlined. What the court said is that we're always talking about whether measures are constitutional, whether the states can do what it's within the FCTC. And what the court did, it says that there was not, that the measure was not only constitutionally valid, but it was mandatory from the international human rights perspective under the obligation to protect the right to health. So they said, of course this measure is valid, but it's not only valid. If the government of Peru was not doing this, they would be affecting the right to health. So they said, based on human rights law, you are obligated to implement the measures as you did. And finally, something they did that we didn't include in our amicus, and I think it was a very progressive thinking on the part of the Constitutional Tribunal, is that they talk about this notion of progressive realization in connection with retrogression, which is a human rights principle that affects economic, social, and cultural rights. And what it says basically is that you need to work towards achieving the fulfillment of the right, and once you have achieved certain level of protection or fulfillment of that right, you cannot go back in that level, so you cannot have a retrogressive measure. And what they said is something that we should start using, we should start working in how we incorporate this idea to our work, because what it says is that if Peru were to change their current legislative system to one that offered a lesser level of protection, that will be a violation of human rights. So this will help us at least protect the measures that we have achieved so far against industry attack, because this will be a standard that we cannot go back on. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.